All right, we started to look at some of the events and some of the issues that came into play with Wycliffe. And, immediately, John Wycliffe goes after Ockhamism. He vehemently opposes nominalism. The differences are pretty clear. John Wycliffe himself was a moderate realist, and he was certainly on the Augustinian band there. He, in fact, he uses Augustine's theological position to just about take down every abuse by the clerics, by the clergy, and also to elevate the position of the king. Now, I think that his elevating the position of Edward III was something that wasn't intentional at first. Certainly did capture Edward III's attention quickly, and there became quite a camaraderie between Edward and John Wycliffe. He was revered in England, not because of Edward III, but because of his students, that he was called father to them, that his students were very much taken by his position. Wycliffe opposed William of Ockham and Duns Scotus, and he put together several treatments against the two writers. Of course, Duns Scotus and William of Ockham believed that God and the supernatural were elevated to the point of being unknown and unknowable. Wycliffe toward the material world is subject to the universals, in which William of Ockham said are always subjective and not objective. But Wycliffe took the position that all the material world is subject to those universals, to God, to the universal church, to virtue in truth and humanity. And that so are individuals. The other position, the nominalistic position, elevated the individual. And because the subjective view was revered, that the church wasn't a church universal, that the church was a parishioner, that the church, or that the politic or the corporation wasn't a corporation, or an institution wasn't an institution, that the individuals making up that institution subjected the institution to themselves. some of the detailed elements of Occam and of Scotus and of Anselm and Aquinas, Rome didn't thoroughly search out. But what Rome did was to incorporate them into the body of belief as a political move. That Rome had taken that position early, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, that the popes of Rome, that the bishops of Rome would look at a movement when it was a popular movement and then incorporate it into its body of belief. And they did that several ways. If an individual was excommunicated for heresy, later down the line you would find them the ban removed. Didn't matter whether they were dead or not. But along with that removal of ban, the Bishop of Rome could then, or the pontiff could then absolve that individual and put them into the communion with the church, and therefore they themselves be saved. Now, I find scripturally that heresy isn't an event for the loss of salvation, excepting where it interferes with sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura. That the elements, that the principles of the Reformation was to give back to the church salvation that was from God. That there was no salvation, in essence, in the church. That those who were saved in the church were consequently saved, not because of the church, but because of their faith. Wycliffe uses the Eucharist and the understanding of the Eucharist, of the church, to declare that the popes from 1000 on, or actually about 1200 on, were indeed the Antichrist. That I find that is the first instance in all of theological writing that refers to that millennial kingdom. That prior to this you don't see it. You don't see it amongst the fathers. You don't see it in the councils. You do not see that element of eschatology anywhere. What you do see prior to this is the imminent return of the Lord, but not the millennial kingdom. So, in other words, when we talk about millennialism in our church, its origin, I would say, is Wycliffe. Not that it's wrong or right, and I won't say whether it's wrong or right. I don't want to stir up conflict here. But I do know this, that the term used in Revelation 20 is kilia, and it is a plural form. So, in other words, if I were to translate that properly, it would be, and he reigns thousands of years. So it's not specific, not intended to be specific. Now, so what is Wycliffe doing here? I think that his point was to link the popes of the time to that which is against Christ. And that was an issue of salvation. That in issue of salvation, the church does not have that authority. And so Wycliffe will say those things that remove that from Rome. And rightly so. He was absolutely right to use that illusion. He claims, his claims were that in the Mass itself was ridden with idolatry. He says, reading from Parker, Wycliffe was categorically opposed to the idolatry encouraged by practices in the Mass, and above all, to the fact that the priest was given an immensely important place in making Christ's body, but as a realist, too, he was long uneasy with the doctrine of transubstantiation. What he was saying there was he was saying that in the act of the priest turning the elements into the actual body and blood of Christ, that he became an idolater. Transubstantiation had been declared a dogma of faith from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And it stated plainly that in the priestly consecration of the elements, the bread and wine were transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. That is, that Christ's body and blood were truly and objectively created, and there remained only the appearance of bread and wine. Now, how did Wycliffe view the Eucharist? It was indeed Christ's body, but not in substance or essence. Only virtually, spiritually, and sacramentally, three modes of being which Wycliffe attempted to define each time clearly, rejecting any thought of material presence or substitution of Christ for the substance of the bread. The determining factor to validate Christ's presence and reception in the Eucharist was the faith of the individual participant, not the authority of the priest. And that becomes a monumental step in Reformation. He, in a sense, he takes on very similar to how Luther viewed the Eucharist. His second point was in regard to hermeneutics. Wycliffe quoted extensively from the Scripture, as well as from canon law and the fathers. But it seems that only gradually and in the course of his university disputes did he come to regard the Bible as supremely authoritative for belief and life. Though he came to exalt Scripture in uncompromising terms, it was only late in his life that he did so. But he took that step concerning the Scripture. So by the time that he was finished with his theological review of what was going on, toward the end of his ministry, he took on sola scriptura and the inerrancy of Scripture. Not only that, but even earlier he had said that not only in distinguishing sharply between the Bible and all other writings, but also in asserting the right of every Christian to read and know it for himself. His principal argument was simple. Holy Scripture was the highest authority for every believer, the standard of faith, and the foundation for reform in religious, political, and social life. Get that. Wycliffe understood that a theological reformation will bring about a social and a political reformation also. And whether it starts socially, politically first, it either ends theologically or it begins theologically. Knowledge of the Bible alone was essential, he argued, and the failure to know it was failure to know Christ. One of the major works of Wycliffe was to translate the Latin into English and to dispense that readily. Rome confiscates all of those translations. And by the time Huss comes onto the scene, you cannot find a translation of Wycliffe. But some other sources state that it was an incredible translation of the Scripture. And in a sense, I believe that. It was probably on the order of Luther's translation in German. I believe this also, that Wycliffe started a tradition in Oxford, and that was toward the Greek. Erasmus kind of finished it. But Oxford became a school of excellence in knowledge of Greek. And this becomes very relevant later when the King James, when the authorized version is finished. And the reason why that becomes very relevant is this, is that Cambridge is given the majority of and the lead for the translation work. I would say that Cambridge could have done the Hebrew portion based on the Latin Vulgate alone. But Cambridge's strong point was in the Latin and not in Greek. The Greek New Testament should have been given in the hands of Oxford. Oxford had tradition from Wycliffe and from Erasmus, something that Cambridge did not have. Although Erasmus had taken some time in Cambridge, but even though Cambridge kind of claims him as his own, as their own. He did not spend much time in Cambridge. Most of his time was spent in Oxford. And I think this also, that the Lollards preserved much of Wycliffe's works, excepting his translation, because that was completely destroyed. But the Lollards preserved much of Wycliffe's works, and I believe that Erasmus was very interested in the works of Wycliffe.
So we have none of Wycliffe's translations extant?
We do not. We do not have any of Wycliffe's translations today. And remember this, that we have a group out there that is probably one of the finest translation groups in the world, and probably one that would ever be assembled in the Wycliffe Bible translators. And, you know, they patterned their endeavor to John Wycliffe. Not just in his understanding that everyone should have the Scripture in their hand, but also in regard to the translation work that they've done. I was amazed when I was in my master's degree program at Western Evangelical. My Greek professor was Dr. Philip Clapp, and he was about 78 to 80 years old time, and he had been immersed in the Greek since he was 3 years old by his father. And he was a man of incredible biblical integrity, unlike many of the other professors there at the time. And I found him, he was the one who encouraged me a great deal to think Greek. And I longed for that day when I could actually think in terms of what the Greek was thinking and perceiving when they read the New Testament. That came about maybe about 5 years ago for me, and it was like opening a door. And that was thanks to Dr. Philip Clapp. But one of the students was a young man that was going on. He wasn't in it for the degree. He was learning as much as he could in languages so that he could go to Papua New Guinea and translate the scriptures from the Hebrew and the Greek into the New Guinea language, one of the New Guinea tribal languages that he was also learning at the same time. He was a true linguist. I'm not a linguist. I am not a linguist. And I'll repeat that. I'm not a linguist. And I teach Greek students, I'm not a linguist. I can understand the grammar. I can understand the concepts. I can see why the construction is the way it is, and I can see how solid it is, and so that's my understanding of thinking of Greek. But this guy was a linguist, and he was learning 3 languages at the same time in a period of 1.5 years, and going to be placed out on the field to what he was doing was he was learning the language of this tribe and recording it in a script, and then going to go and teach that script and teach that tribe how to read. Then he would put scripture. He would translate from the Greek and the Hebrew right into their language of script that he had taught them. incredible operation. Some of the stats are also very incredible. I don't know if you knew this, but there are 6,500 languages, known languages, and only about 2,800 of them are translated with Scripture. Now, that doesn't mean that the same is in regard to populations. Of course, you know, the populations are different. And it might be that 75 to 80% of the world's population has Scripture in their vernacular. But that doesn't mean that the 25% should be left out, nor the 4,500 known languages yet to go. So it's an incredible task that Wycliffe himself started. Prior to that, all evangelism was from Rome. And the basis of that evangelism was on the Latin text and Rome's interpretation. And those who were coming to the church, and that's what it was essentially, coming to the church, those who were coming to the church came on the terms of the Church of Rome. Domini, 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 you're all Catholics now. So the message was very different. The Scripture was not provided. And Wycliffe sought to reverse that. His third, should I say, foundation or treatment was of lordship. In other words, he was going to deal with the politic. But it had theological connotations. Believe me, politics have theological connotations. Parker states, his arguments about lordship sketched out conclusions that could be exploited to attack all ecclesiastical abuses. In other words, he was developing a theological approach to combat every ecclesiastical abuse that he saw in England. And where did he go? He went to Augustine for that. And here are some of his arguments. He made statement that the church was the predestined body of the elect. The predestined body of the elect. Predestination had been argued out most fully, if not clearly, by Augustine in the early Christian church. And although the doctrine thereafter had not been abandoned in official teaching, it was not prominently proclaimed. In other words, Augustinianism was still there, but it had not been taught in the church and not endorsed in the church. And it certainly not been endorsed in Rome, because had Augustinianism been endorsed from Rome, Rome's authority would dwindle. Part of the reason for this neglect was to be found in the importance that men attached to the organized church in its authority to the sacraments for salvation. In other words, it became dogma in the Catholic Church that salvation was entered into by the Eucharist, by the communion of the church. And that was only accomplished through the hands of the priest, through the hands of the one in authority, given the authority through apostolic succession. He stated that the church visible does not possess salvation, nor can the Pope dispense it. And I love that statement. That's a terrific statement. The church visible does not possess salvation, nor can the Pope dispense it. Wycliffe argued in biblical terms that God had predestined some for salvation while the others, condemned to damnation, he merely foreknew. He dealt with the understanding of double predestination. He felt that the lack of salvation was something foreknown by God rather than predestined by God, but that the elect themselves were predestined by God unto salvation. He used predestination to attack unum sanctum, which was Boniface's bull, Boniface VIII's bull, that the Pope was head of the church and that all Christians had to be subject to him for their salvation. He also contended that God's grace was available for every Christian without the need to believe in the claims of any ecclesiastical leader, whose commands each time had to be tested by Scripture. He repudiated not only ecclesiastical authority, but all privileges or concern for civil affairs. Now, this is what captured Edward III's attention. And corrupt and superstitious practices such as pilgrimages, the cult of saints, or the selling of indulgences, with its accompanying belief in the treasury of merits for pardons, all brought about by papal bull. His appeal to predestination cut away all pretense to authority or institutionalism in the church. Now, I hope you can get an inkling of the degree of reform that Wycliffe was talking about. Remember that the church possessed various ways of getting wealth. And all of those were attacked. All of those were put aside with his reform. In fact, later, as a result of the theological reform of Wycliffe, Edward III started to tax the church. And pretty soon, properties were being absconded or withdrawn from the church. And that, by the way, was to support the beginning of the 100 Years' War with France. He had some logic behind that. One, he had the theological basis that Wycliffe had put together. He also had the logic that if his enemies were given the opportunity to sustain wealth out of favor from Rome, then he will take his own opportunity in England. Now, consequently, both Wycliffe and Edward are excommunicated. But the Pope realized this also, that he could lose big time in England. And he knew that, and so he started to negotiate with Edward. And he negotiated a deal. And the deal is this, that the Pope would reduce the amount of taxes in England to match that of France. By the way, it didn't go over too big in France, but it at least sufficed, it placated Edward. And you see, Edward thought that the church held salvation. And that notion was with the monarchs. That notion was one of those ideas that, do I step that way or don't I? When it was very, should I say, prudent for Edward to go that direction, he had a great deal to lose in Normandy. When it was prudent for him to go that direction, he needed to go that direction. Otherwise, he would have, economically, it would have been a disaster for England. England would have not recovered from such a burden that the Pope had put on them. And also trying to protect his holdings in Normandy. Actually, he had more than that. He had much more than that. And the French at the time, because Wycliffe, by the way, the French at the time gained great ground. The French declined and England gained great ground. In fact, they went all the way to the Mediterranean. They had Aragon. They had Poitou. France, the French kingdom, was just a small portion of land east of Normandy. And it so happens that Avignon remained French. It is hard to say which came first in regard to Wycliffe. Was his response theologically just based on the church's moral decay or abuses? Or did it start in study? And I think you can ask that question, but I'm not sure that you're going to satisfy that question. I noticed that neither Pelican nor Oberman really say that Wycliffe, his initial Reformation was strictly theological. One can't tell because that was kind of an individual thing. And yet, in regard to Wycliffe, you see this intense universal understanding, yet that faith and grace were very individual. And the universalism of the church was based on that individual relationship directly to God, not through the church. It is a reverse order, isn't it, of what was accepted at the time. Ockhamism was not far removed from the notion or the theology of Rome when Occam was excommunicated. He was right in line with what the popes were doing. So it was not a difficult decision for the Pope to lift the ban on Occam, on William of Ockham, and embrace Occamism into the church. He would only gain with it. When I speak in these terms, that is the essence of what it was all about. Gain. From Rome and from the monarchs. The nation would be supported or not with monarchy through the politic. Or that Rome would be supported or not through the politic. I will clarify this, that there were some German princes who were so swayed in terms of the theological Reformation that they did not enter into that for their own benefit, because it almost destroyed them. In fact, Charles at one time had the Schmalkald League absolutely on the ropes. That he had defeated it, that Protestantism, that Lutheranism was defeated in Germany at one time. So there were some German princes who their sole purpose of supporting Martin Luther was a basis of faith. And I want you to know that the support of the Lutheran princes kept the Reformation on the continent alive. But it wasn't going to grow. It was not going to grow after around 1583, at the Peace of Heidelberg. And the Peace of Heidelberg was set up by Charles V because the eastern portion of his Holy Roman Empire was under attack by the Turks. And he needed the help of the Lutheran princes to stave off that attack. And so even though he had pretty much them and put them down, he still needed their help. And so he arranged for the Peace of Heidelberg. And Peace of Heidelberg, it was stated that those principalities that were Lutheran would remain Lutheran, those that were Catholic would remain Catholic. So even today, that is the case in Germany. Lutheranism has not increased in Germany since 1573, 1583. And Catholicism hasn't increased. In fact, both are dead in Germany. It's anything having to do with any sort of evangelistic theology is, in of all places, parachurch organizations like the YMCA. And I shake my head out about that myself. The YMCA, here's a Unitarian organization that promotes evangelical theology in Germany.
Are there not other church organizations active there, such as, Youth for Christ or whatever?
Yes, there are other parachurch organizations active, but the YMCA has the biggest hold because they're so activity oriented. But Youth for Christ isn't there, but the Campus Crusade is, and then the Graham Crusades and other Louis Palau Crusades have had some impact. The beauty of that is this: currently in Germany, the churches, whether it's Lutheran or Catholic, the church is a state institution. And so they get their taxes whether people go or not. But there are ways of getting out of some taxes. And that is to not, for instance, be married in a Lutheran church or a Catholic church, because there's taxes involved in that, to not go, there's taxes involved in that, but they do send a bill. But they also take an attendance tax. So when you go, you're taxed, and then once a year, a portion of your income goes to the church, and I believe that's a 10%. Goes to the parish. So the parachurch organizations have established themselves based on that lack of tax. That the theology alive, so to speak, is in those parachurch organizations. And anything to do with the Scripture is also in those parachurch organizations. And it's all lay leadership. There is no clergy, there is no clerical support of theology in Germany. That has been the way it has been since World War II. And a large portion of that has to do with what the Third Reich did in regard to the churches and try to build a theology around the Third Reich. It destroyed the credibility of the churches, and the ones who remained were killed. The ones who stood on Scripture, like Bonhoeffer, were killed, and some like Karl Barth. Not that Karl Barth was evangelical; he wasn't. But I think that he's as evangelical as most churches out there in America today. You would find that as you read Karl Barth, you'll probably agree with him 9% of the time. But where you have to depart from him is he has tendencies toward universalism. And out of Romans 5, he says, well, all men shall be saved. But that's because of his hermeneutic.
So the churches there are pretty much a thing of the past.
Oh, they're still attended. They're still attended, but they're dead. The state church is dead. It's disintegrated. It's theologically malnourished.
But the attendance is very sparse.
Yes, the attendance is very sparse.
Even on the high hall, or when you have high mass there on the holidays, the attendance at best is probably only 50%.
Right.
Any capacity of the church, and then any other time, it's very, very low, less than 30%. It is a totally institutionalized function, and in Germany, there are many Germans that just absolutely cringe at the fact they have to pay that tax.
Right.
They hate it.
Yes, they do. Yes, the Germans do hate that tax. Yes. In regard to some of the abuses that Wycliffe had seen, in his time, Rome gathered money by selling indulgences. Oops. By what they call annates, or the sale of clerical offices. And this was gathered two ways. By the initial sale of the office when it became vacant, and the annual take on the first year. Totally went to Rome. So it was kind of like a dowry. that the second son of the noble would buy the bishopric or the position of abbot, and he would be appointed. Rome would get a take on that. Then he would, being appointed, his first entire take of that see would go directly to Rome. So there would be no funds within his see. The following year he'd have a flat tax. So every year after that there would be a flat tax going to Rome. That there were expedite fees. For a curia business. So if a nobleman wanted to bring business before the Pope, he had to pay a fee to get his, and the more the fee, the quicker he would get his business done. If he didn't pay the fee, he may be sitting in Avignon for 10 years. That the bishop could extract, and I want to say that, extract bounty or hospitality. And these could be very extravagant. If a bishop rolled into town, literally the bishop could remove most of the wealth from that town if he so cared. So if you were concerned about the economy of your town, you didn't want the bishop to come. Later, in 1336, though, this became into a flat tax. But that didn't mean that the bishop would not get hospitality if he came. It's just that he couldn't extract it. He couldn't extract it as bounty. So annually, this becomes a flat tax on each principality, on each congregation. And by the way, that is still in use today. Hospitality. I know of a little congregation in Northern California who had about $15,000 in a memorial fund from a lawyer who gave that to the church for the purpose of restoring their cemetery that had just fallen apart. And the bishop came in from San Francisco and absconded with the entire $15,000 for the sea and left that little church with nothing. Now the people, and the reason is he could do that was because it was in the name of the church. Now what the members of the church have done is they take two offerings. One goes to the bishop. That's the first offering. The second one goes in the name of some of the deacons. And it's in their individual name. Now, that's a reformation. There's a reformation happening in a little congregation in California, and it's on over the same stuff that Wycliffe was concerned about. They also put together a community pool, a community association, not apart from the church altogether, so that they could also collect funds. So that they could also collect funds for the refurbishment of their cemetery. That fifthly, the bishop had what they called the right of spoil, or excuse me, not the bishop, but the church had the right of spoil. Now what that means is that when a bishop died in office, all of the properties were to go back to the estate. But there were all those properties that were kind of left hanging. Well, the church had the right of, and that was a big, big draw. That was a very large economic figure. So all of the ways that the church had to incorporate or bring in money unto itself, and it became quite well off indeed. It became the financial, economic corporation in all the world.